The restaurant looked beautiful from the outside, with its tall glass windows glowing warmly every evening. Inside, soft music played in the background, and the gentle sound of cutlery and quiet conversations filled the air. It was the kind of place where people came to celebrate important moments or to feel important themselves. Expensive suits, elegant dresses, and confident laughter were common here. Everything seemed polished and perfect. Among all of this, she moved quietly. She carried trays, refilled glasses, and smiled politely at guests who rarely looked at her twice. Her steps were light, almost practiced, as if she had learned how to exist without drawing attention. She knew the rhythm of the place better than anyone. When to approach a table, when to step back, when to speak, and when to stay silent. It had become second nature to her. Most people saw her as just another waitress. But there was something different about the way she observed things. She noticed small details, like how a guest tapped their fingers when they were nervous, or how someone's smile didn't quite reach their eyes. She could tell when a table wanted privacy or when they were open to conversation. This quiet awareness made her good at her job, even if no one openly praised her for it. Her life was simple, at least on the surface. She lived in a small apartment not too far from the restaurant. The space was modest, with just enough furniture to get by. A bed, a small table, a chair near the window. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Every morning, she woke up early, made herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window for a few minutes before getting ready for work. Those quiet moments were important to her. They were the only time in the day when everything felt still. She didn't have many people in her life. No close friends she met often, no family nearby to visit. Her phone stayed mostly silent, except for work messages or occasional reminders. It wasn't that she disliked people. It was more that life had slowly pulled her into a routine where there wasn't much space left for anything else. And yet, she didn't seem bitter. There was a calmness about her, like someone who had learned to accept things without making a fuss. She didn't complain. She didn't compare her life to others. She simply moved forward one day at a time. Inside the restaurant, there was one thing that always caught her attention. The piano. It stood near the far corner, close to a large window that overlooked the city lights. It was a beautiful instrument, polished and elegant, but rarely used. Sometimes, on special nights, a hired musician would come and play soft background music. But most days, it just sat there, quiet and untouched. Still, she looked at it often. Whenever she passed by, her eyes would rest on it for a second longer than necessary. It wasn't obvious to others, but if someone paid close attention, they would notice it. There was something in her expression during those moments, something thoughtful, almost distant. Once, during a slow afternoon, she had paused near it. The restaurant was nearly empty. Only a few tables were occupied, and the usual noise was replaced by a gentle silence. She had been carrying a tray, but stopped for a moment, standing a few steps away from the piano. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, as if she was holding herself back from doing something. She looked at the keys. Clean, smooth, waiting. For a brief second, it seemed like she might walk over and touch them. But then a voice from the kitchen called her name, and the moment passed. She turned away quickly and went back to work, as if nothing had happened. That was how it always was. Small moments that came and went, unnoticed by everyone except her. Her coworkers didn't know much about her either. They saw her as quiet but reliable. Someone who didn't cause trouble and didn't get involved in drama. While others chatted during breaks or complained about difficult customers, she usually stayed to herself. Sometimes she listened, sometimes she simply smiled, but she rarely shared anything personal. A few of them had tried to get to know her better at the beginning. They asked where she was from, what she liked to do, if she had any hobbies. She always gave short, polite answers. Enough to be kind, but not enough to open up. After a while, people stopped asking. Not out of dislike, but because they assumed she preferred it that way. And maybe she did. There are some stories people don't know how to tell. Some memories that feel easier to keep inside rather than explain. So she kept going day after day. Serving tables, clearing plates, smiling at strangers. The restaurant changed slightly depending on the time of day. Lunch hours were brighter and faster, with business meetings and quick conversations. Evenings were softer, more relaxed, filled with couples and long dinners. But no matter the time, she remained the same. Steady, quiet, present. Sometimes, when the night grew late and most guests had left, she would be among the last to finish cleaning. Those were the moments she liked the most. The lights were dimmer, the noise almost gone. Chairs were neatly placed, tables wiped clean. The restaurant felt like a different place, less formal, more real. She moved slowly then, not rushing, just taking her time. And the piano was always there, waiting in the corner. On one such night, she found herself standing near it again. The room was empty except for a few staff members finishing their tasks. The soft hum of distant voices came from the kitchen, but out here, it was quiet. She stepped closer this time, closer than she usually allowed herself. Her hand lifted slightly, just a little. Her fingers hovered in the air, inches away from the keys. There was a pause, a long, quiet pause. Felt like time had slowed down. Then she pulled her hand back. A small breath escaped her lips, almost like a sigh. She glanced around quickly, as if making sure no one had seen her. Then she turned away again, picking up a cloth and continuing her work. Nothing happened. At least that's how it looked. But something inside her had stirred. Something old. Something familiar. It didn't show on her face, but it stayed with her. Even as she walked home that night, under the dim streetlights, her thoughts felt heavier than usual. Not in a bad way, but in a way that suggested something was slowly rising to the surface. A memory, maybe, or a part of herself she had kept hidden for too long. When she reached her apartment, she went through her usual routine. She placed her bag down, changed her clothes, and made herself a cup of tea. Then she sat by the window just like she always did. But tonight was different. Her eyes didn't wander outside. Instead, they stayed still, focused on nothing in particular. Her fingers rested lightly on her lap, but they moved slightly, almost unconsciously. A soft tapping motion, like they were remembering something, like they knew something her mind was trying to ignore. She noticed it after a moment and stopped. Then she smiled faintly. It wasn't a big smile, just a small one. The kind that appears quietly and disappears just as quickly. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a second. The world outside continued as usual. Cars passed. Lights flickered. People moved on with their lives. Inside her small apartment, everything was still. Tomorrow would be another day at the restaurant. Another day of serving, smiling, and staying unnoticed. But somewhere deep inside, something had already begun to change. And she didn't even realize it yet. The next evening at the restaurant started like any other, but there was a different kind of energy in the air. Staff members moved a little faster, managers checked everything twice, and even the lighting seemed more carefully adjusted. It was clear that someone important was expected. Whispers traveled quietly between the staff. A very wealthy guest was coming. Not just wealthy but known. The kind of person people recognized without needing an introduction. Someone who owned companies, appeared in news stories, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. The kind of person who didn't visit places like this often, but when he did, everything changed. She noticed the shift immediately. The manager gave extra instructions, reminding everyone to be sharp, polite, and attentive. Tables were rearranged slightly to create space near the center of the room. The best cutlery was placed out. Even the piano in the corner was wiped again, its surface shining under the lights. She listened quietly, nodding when needed, but didn't ask questions. It didn't really matter who was coming. To her, it was just another night of work. Still, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something unusual was about to happen. As the evening began, guests started arriving one by one. The restaurant slowly filled with soft conversations and gentle laughter. Everything looked normal on the surface, but the staff stayed alert, waiting for that one moment. Then it came. A sleek black car stopped outside the restaurant. The entrance doors opened, and a tall man stepped in, surrounded by a small group. His presence was calm but powerful. He didn't need to say much or act loudly. People noticed him anyway. Conversations slowed for a second as eyes turned toward him. He walked in like someone who was used to being watched. Not arrogant in an obvious way, but confident enough to know he belonged wherever he went. The manager greeted him personally, with a smile that was slightly more careful than usual. He was led to the best table in the restaurant, placed perfectly so he could see almost everything around him. She was assigned to serve that table. When she heard this, she simply nodded and picked up her tray. No excitement, no nervousness on the surface. But inside, she felt a small shift. Not fear, just awareness. She approached the table calmly, her steps steady as always. As she placed glasses and poured water, she kept her movements smooth and quiet. She didn't rush, and she didn't linger longer than needed. The man glanced at her briefly. Not in a rude way, just a quick look, like he was observing everything around him. His eyes were sharp, the kind that missed very little. Then he returned his attention to his guests, continuing his conversation as if nothing had happened. For a while, everything went as expected. Orders were taken, food was served, and conversations flowed. The table was lively, filled with business talk, light jokes, and confident voices. Laughter came easily to them, the kind that suggested comfort and control. She moved in and out quietly, doing her job. But then, something changed. At one point during the evening, the conversation at the table shifted. It became lighter, more relaxed. Someone made a comment about the atmosphere of the restaurant, mentioning how elegant it felt but how quiet the piano in the corner looked. "Does anyone even play that?" one of the guests asked, glancing toward it. The man leaned back slightly in his chair and followed the direction of the gaze. The piano stood there, untouched, just as always. A small smile appeared on his face. "That's a shame," he said calmly. "A place like this should have music." Another guest laughed lightly. "Maybe we should ask someone to play." The idea seemed like a joke at first, but then it didn't. The man's expression shifted just slightly, like something had caught his interest. He looked around the room, observing the staff, the guests, the space itself. Then his eyes paused. On her. She had just stepped near the table to clear a plate. For a brief second, their eyes met again. This time, his gaze lingered a little longer. Not in a personal way, more like curiosity. "Do any of the staff play?" he asked, his voice calm but clear enough to carry. The manager, who had been standing nearby, quickly stepped forward. "Sometimes we arrange musicians for special evenings," he replied carefully. "But tonight?" the man asked. The manager hesitated for a moment. Then one of the other staff members, trying to be helpful, or maybe just careless, spoke up. "I think she mentioned once that she knows a little." The words hung in the air. For a second, no one reacted. Then all eyes turned toward her. She froze, just for a moment. It wasn't obvious, but inside, everything paused. Her hands, her thoughts, her breath. It all felt still. She hadn't expected this. The manager looked slightly surprised, clearly not aware of this detail. The guests at the table seemed amused, curious to see what would happen next. The man watched her closely now. "Is that true?" he asked, his tone not demanding, but firm enough that it didn't feel like a simple question. She swallowed softly. I'm not really a performer," she said gently. "I haven't played in a long time." Her voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something careful. The guests exchanged glances, some smiling, some already entertained by the situation. The man leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "I'm not asking for a performance," he said. "Just something simple." Simple. The word felt heavier than it should have. She shook her head lightly. "I don't think I'm the right person for that." A few soft chuckles came from the table. Not cruel, but not kind either. The man's expression didn't change much, but there was a spark of interest in his eyes now. He wasn't used to people refusing him. "Just a basic tune," he said. "Nothing complicated." There was a pause. The room seemed quieter than before, even though other guests continued their conversations. The moment had created a small circle of attention around them. She felt it. All of it. The expectation, the curiosity, the quiet pressure. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray she was holding. For a second, she considered walking away, giving a polite excuse and returning to the safety of her routine. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way everyone was watching. Or maybe it was something deeper. Something she didn't fully understand herself. The manager looked unsure, but didn't interrupt. It was clear that refusing again might not be taken well. She took a small breath, then nodded. "All right," she said quietly. The reaction was immediate. A few smiles, a bit of excitement, and a sense of anticipation filled the space. It was no longer just a casual evening. Now it had turned into something unexpected. She placed the tray down carefully and wiped her hands lightly on her apron. Her steps toward the piano felt slower than usual. Not because she was unsure where to go, but because each step carried weight. Memories, feelings, things she had kept buried for a long time. As she reached the piano, she paused for a second. The same piano she had looked at so many times. The same keys she had almost touched before. Now there was no turning back. She sat down slowly. The bench felt familiar even after so long. Her hands rested gently in her lap. For a moment she didn't move. The room waited. Not completely silent, but quiet enough that the shift in attention was clear. The man leaned back again, watching closely. He expected something simple, maybe even something awkward, something that would entertain them for a minute or two. Nothing more. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys. They felt cool and smooth under her touch. Her heart beat a little faster, but her face remained calm. She pressed the first note. Soft, careful, just the beginning of a very simple tune. Exactly what was asked. And yet, something about the way she played it felt different. Not because it was complex, but because it wasn't empty. Each note carried something. Something real. Something that didn't quite match the idea of just a simple tune. The room didn't realize it yet, but something had already begun to change. The first few notes stayed soft, almost uncertain, as if they were testing the air before settling into it. Her fingers moved slowly, pressing each key with care. It was exactly what had been asked of her. A simple tune, something light, something easy to listen to. At first, the guests at the table didn't pay much attention. A few of them continued their conversation in low voices. One person took a sip of a drink. Another leaned back in their chair, relaxed. To them, it was just background music now. Something pleasant, but not important. The man who had asked her to play watched quietly. His expression was calm, but his eyes stayed fixed on her hands. He seemed curious, like he was waiting to see where this would go. Even though he didn't expect much, she kept playing. The melody was familiar, simple, the kind of tune many people had heard before in one form or another. Her hands moved gently, without showing off, without trying to impress. There was no sudden speed, no dramatic movement, just control, just calm. But inside her, things were not as steady. Her thoughts moved quickly, even though her hands stayed steady. It felt strange to be sitting there again, in front of a piano with people watching. It had been so long, too long. For a brief moment, doubt slipped in. What if she made a mistake? What if her fingers forgot what they once knew so well? What if this turned into something embarrassing? The questions came and went, but she didn't stop. Her eyes stayed on the keys. Her breathing slowly matched the rhythm of the music. And then, something changed. It wasn't sudden. It didn't happen in one big moment. It was small, almost invisible. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Her fingers pressed the keys with a little more confidence. The spaces between the notes became smoother. The melody began to flow instead of pause. She was no longer just playing the notes. She was starting to feel them. The sound grew warmer. Not louder, not faster, just fuller. Like the tune was slowly waking up. A few guests in the restaurant began to notice. Not because the music had become dramatic, but because it had become real. It no longer sounded like something played out of obligation. It sounded like something that meant something. One of the guests at the table stopped speaking mid-sentence. Another turned their head slightly toward the piano. The man leaned forward just a little. Still silent, still watching. Her fingers moved more naturally now. The hesitation that had been there at the beginning started to fade. In its place came something deeper. Something that had been quiet for a long time, now finding its way back. The simple tune didn't stay simple. It began to stretch. A few extra notes slipped in, soft at first, almost like a whisper added between words. Then another, and another. It was subtle. So subtle that if someone wasn't paying attention, they might miss it. But the feeling of the music was changing. She wasn't thinking about the room anymore. She wasn't thinking about the people watching her. She wasn't thinking about the man who had asked her to play. Her focus narrowed to just one thing. The piano. The sound. The movement of her hands. Her fingers began to move with more freedom. The melody, once straight and predictable, now curved and shifted. It carried small pieces of something personal. Something she hadn't planned to show, but couldn't hold back either. A quiet emotion began to settle into the music. Not sadness. Not happiness. Something in between. Something honest. The restaurant slowly grew quieter. Conversations didn't stop completely, but they softened. People began to listen without realizing they were doing it. It was no longer just background sound. It was something pulling attention toward it. At the table, the guests were no longer smiling at the situation. They were listening now. One of them placed their glass down slowly, eyes fixed on her. Another leaned forward slightly, as if trying to catch every note. The man's expression had changed. The small, amused smile he had at the beginning was gone. In its place was something more focused, more serious. He hadn't expected this. Not from a simple tune. Not from someone who had said she hadn't played in a long time. She continued. Her hands moved more confidently now, gliding across the keys with ease. The melody grew richer, building slowly, like a story unfolding piece by piece. There were still moments of softness, but now there were also moments of strength. A deeper sound, a stronger touch, felt like something inside her had opened, something that had been quiet for years. Each note carried a piece of it, a memory, a feeling, a part of her that had stayed hidden. She didn't look up. She didn't check if people were watching. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the room without seeing it. The silence had grown heavier, not uncomfortable, but full. The kind of silence that happens when people are paying attention without wanting to break the moment. Her fingers moved faster now. Not rushed, not out of control, but alive. The simple tune had transformed completely. It was no longer just a tune. It had become something else. Something bigger. Something that held weight. At one point, her hand paused for a fraction of a second. Just one breath. And then continued. That tiny pause made the next notes feel even stronger. Even more meaningful. A few people in the restaurant had turned fully in their seats now, facing the piano. Staff members stood still for a moment longer than they should have, caught in the sound. Even those who didn't understand music could feel it. Because it wasn't about skill anymore. It was about emotion. The man at the table sat still, his gaze locked on her hands. There was no amusement left. Only attention. Only interest. Only something he hadn't expected to feel. Respect. The music continued to build, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in depth. Each note connected to the next, forming something smooth and powerful. It felt like a story being told without words. A story of something left behind, and something found again. Her face remained calm, but there was a quiet intensity in it now. Her fingers didn't hesitate anymore. They knew where to go. They remembered, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for a reason to return. The restaurant was fully quiet now. No one spoke. No one moved loudly. Even the smallest sounds seemed to fade away. All that remained was the music, and the feeling it carried. She didn't notice how many people were watching now. She didn't notice the way the entire room had shifted. Because in that moment, she wasn't a waitress. She wasn't someone trying to prove anything. She was simply someone playing. Someone remembering. Someone letting something real come through. The final notes of this part of the melody slowed slightly. Not ending. Not yet. But preparing. Like a breath before something deeper. And in that quiet space between the notes, one thing became clear. This was no longer a simple tune. And whatever came next would not be expected. The pause between the notes felt longer than it really was. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Even the soft sounds that usually filled the restaurant had disappeared completely. Her fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment. Then she continued. But this time it was different. The next notes didn't follow the same simple path as before. They didn't return to the light, easy melody that had started everything. Instead, they moved in a new direction. Deeper, fuller, and far more expressive. It was no longer a tune someone could hum casually. It had become something layered. Something alive. Her hands moved with a quiet confidence now. There was no hesitation left. No sign of the uncertainty that had been there at the beginning. Each movement felt natural, as if her fingers already knew the story they wanted to tell. The sound of the piano filled the room more completely. It wasn't louder in a harsh way, but it carried more presence. The notes stretched wider, reaching into every corner of the space. People felt it, not just heard it. At the table, the guests sat completely still. One of them had slowly leaned forward, resting their elbows on the table, eyes fixed on her hands. Another had stopped mid-motion, a glass still in hand, forgotten. The man who had asked her to play no longer looked relaxed. He sat upright now, his attention fully captured. There was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. A realization. A quiet understanding that what he was witnessing was not ordinary. She continued to play, and the music grew stronger. Not rushed, not chaotic, just powerful in a controlled way. Her left hand moved steadily, building a foundation, while her right hand danced across the higher notes. The combination created something rich and emotional, like two voices speaking at once. Felt like a conversation, not with the room, not with the audience, but with something inside her. Her face remained calm, but there was a depth in her eyes now, a focus that came from somewhere far beyond the moment. It was clear she wasn't thinking about being watched anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere only the music could take her. The melody shifted again, growing more complex. Small details appeared, gentle changes in rhythm, slight pauses, unexpected turns. It was no longer predictable. Each moment felt new, as if it was being created right then and there. And yet, it didn't feel random. Felt intentional. Felt meaningful. A soft rise in the music began to form. Started slowly, almost unnoticed, but then it built. Note by note, the sound grew, carrying more emotion, more weight. It wasn't overwhelming, but it demanded attention. A few people in the restaurant felt a chill. Not because of the temperature, but because the music touched something deeper than they expected. One of the staff members near the back stopped completely, a cloth still in hand, eyes fixed on the piano. Even the manager, who had been worried about keeping everything perfect, forgot to move for a moment. Everyone was listening now, truly listening. The man at the table slowly placed his hands together, resting them near his chin. His eyes didn't leave her hands. The confidence he carried earlier had softened into something quieter. Respect, curiosity, and something close to admiration. This was not what he had asked for. He had expected something small, something simple, maybe even something slightly awkward. Instead, he was watching something rare, something real. Her hands moved faster now, but still with control. There was no panic, no rush, just flow. The music climbed higher, reaching a peak that felt both strong and emotional. It carried a sense of release, like something that had been held back for too long was finally being allowed to breathe. For a moment, it felt like everything else in the world had disappeared. There was no restaurant, no guests, no expectations, only the sound, only the movement, only her. Then, just as the music reached its highest point, it softened. Not suddenly, but gently, like a wave pulling back after reaching the shore. The notes became quieter again, but not empty. They still carried the same depth, the same feeling, just in a more delicate way. Felt like the end of a story, not rushed, not forced, but complete. Her fingers slowed, each note spaced slightly further apart. Each one allowed to linger just a little longer in the air. The room remained silent. No one dared to interrupt. Even breathing felt too loud. She played the final few notes with care, letting them settle naturally. There was no dramatic ending, no sudden stop, just a gentle finish, a quiet closing. Her hands rested on the keys for a second after the last note. Then she slowly lifted them. The silence that followed was deep, heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when something meaningful has just ended, and people need a moment to return to reality. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Just one person, then another, and another. Within moments, the entire restaurant filled with applause. Not loud in a chaotic way, but strong and genuine. People weren't clapping out of politeness. They were clapping because they felt something, because they had witnessed something unexpected, something honest. She sat still for a moment, as if the sound of the applause hadn't reached her yet. Then she stood up slowly. Her expression was calm, but there was a slight softness in her eyes now. Not pride, not excitement, just a quiet awareness that something had happened, something important. She turned slightly, facing the room for the first time since she started playing. Dozens of eyes were on her, but this time it felt different. Not judging, not expecting, just appreciating. At the table, the man stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple, deliberate movement. The applause continued around him, but his focus remained on her. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at her, as if trying to understand how someone he had seen as ordinary only moments ago could carry something so extraordinary. The noise in the room slowly began to settle. The applause faded, leaving behind a quiet buzz of whispers and reactions. People leaned toward each other, speaking softly, sharing what they had just experienced. But the space between her and the man remained still, unspoken, important. She stepped away from the piano, her movements calm as always. But nothing was the same anymore. Not the room, not the people, and not the way she was being seen. What had started as a simple request had turned into something no one had expected. And in that moment, one thing was clear. The night was no longer ordinary, and it wasn't over yet. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling in the room did not disappear. It stayed there, quiet but strong, like something had shifted in a way no one could ignore. People were still looking at her, not with curiosity anymore, but with a kind of respect they hadn't shown before. She stood near the piano for a moment, unsure of what to do next. For so long, she had been someone who moved quietly through the room, unnoticed. Now every step felt visible. Every movement felt observed. It was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, but she didn't panic. She simply took a slow breath and turned back toward her work. Because that was what she knew. That was what felt safe. She picked up her tray again, her hands steady, even though her heart still carried the echo of the music she had just played. She moved toward a nearby table, ready to continue as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Before she could take more than a few steps, a voice stopped her. Wait! It was calm, not loud, but it carried enough weight that the room seemed to pause again. She turned. The man was standing a few steps away from his table now, looking directly at her. His expression was no longer distant or curious. It was focused, serious in a quiet way. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he took a few steps closer. Up close, there was something different about him than what most people saw at a distance. The confidence was still there, but now there was also something else, something more thoughtful. You said you hadn't played in a long time, he said. His tone wasn't accusing. It was calm, almost careful. She nodded slightly. I haven't. He studied her face for a moment, as if trying to find something in her answer. That didn't sound like someone who forgot, he said. She didn't respond right away. There wasn't a simple answer to that. How do you explain something you never really lost? How do you explain something you simply stopped showing? I used to play, she said quietly. A long time ago. The words were simple, but they carried more than they revealed. He didn't interrupt. He waited. And for some reason, she continued. It was different back then, she added. Life was different. She didn't go into detail. She didn't explain everything. But her voice held enough truth that it didn't feel incomplete. The man gave a small nod, as if he understood more than she had said. Around them, the restaurant had started to return to its normal rhythm. Conversations slowly picked up again, though softer than before. People still glanced in their direction, but they tried not to stare openly. At the table, the guests watched quietly, listening without making it obvious. You trained? He asked. She nodded again. Yes. Professionally. Another small pause. Then, yes. He let that settle for a moment. There was no rush in his questions, no pressure in his tone. It felt less like an interrogation and more like a conversation he actually cared about. Then why stop? It was a simple question, but not an easy one. She looked down for a second, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the tray. Sometimes things don't go the way you plan, she said. Sometimes you have to choose something else. It wasn't a full answer, but it was honest. He didn't push further. Instead, he took a step back, giving her a little space. That wasn't just skill, he said after a moment. That was something more. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she stayed quiet. At the table, one of the guests finally spoke, unable to hold back their curiosity. You should be on a stage somewhere, they said, their voice filled with genuine surprise. Not working here. She glanced toward them briefly, then back at the man. I work here because I need to, she said simply. No shame. No apology, just truth. The man's expression softened slightly. He understood that kind of answer. Need was something he knew well, even if it had been a long time since he felt it the same way. For a moment, the conversation paused again. But this time it wasn't awkward. It felt like both of them were thinking, measuring something. Then he spoke again. Do you still play? He asked. She shook her head lightly. Not really. But you could. It wasn't a question. She looked at him, meeting his eyes directly this time. Yes, she said. There was no hesitation in that answer, because deep down she knew it was true. The ability hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting. The man glanced toward the piano for a second, then back at her. You didn't just play a tune, he said. You turned it into something else. She didn't smile, but there was a slight warmth in her expression now. Sometimes simple things become more, she said quietly. He let out a small breath, almost like a quiet laugh. That's one way to put it. The guests at the table smiled, but this time it wasn't amusement. It was appreciation, respect. One of them leaned forward slightly. Have you ever performed publicly? They asked. She hesitated for a moment. Not in a long time, she said. How long? She thought for a second. Years. That answer seemed to surprise them even more. Years. And yet, what they had just heard didn't sound like something forgotten. It sounded alive. The man crossed his arms lightly, still watching her. There was a shift in his thinking now. Something forming. Something he hadn't planned when he walked into the restaurant. You know, he said slowly, people spend years trying to learn what you just showed in a few minutes. She didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she didn't know what to do with that kind of statement. Compliments like that felt unfamiliar. He studied her for another moment. Then he nodded once, as if coming to a quiet decision. Go back to your work, he said. The words might have sounded dismissive from someone else, but not from him. There was no dismissal in his tone. Only thought. Only intention. She nodded and stepped back, returning to her tasks. But this time it felt different. Not because the work had changed, but because the way people looked at her had changed. Guests who had barely noticed her before now thanked her more warmly. Some gave small smiles, others nodded with quiet respect. Even her co-workers looked at her differently. Surprised, curious, impressed. But she didn't let it overwhelm her. She continued to move as she always had. Steady, calm, focused. Still, something inside her had shifted. The music she had played wasn't just sound. It had opened something. Something she had kept closed for a long time. And now it didn't feel as distant anymore. At the table, the man sat back down, but his attention didn't return fully to the conversation. Every now and then, his eyes followed her as she moved through the room. Not in a controlling way, but in a thoughtful one. As if he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. Something rare. Something worth understanding. The night continued, but it no longer felt like just another evening. Felt like the beginning of something. Something neither of them had planned. But something that was already starting to take shape. And neither of them fully realized just how much it would change everything. The night slowly moved toward its end, but the feeling from earlier still lingered in the air. The restaurant was no longer as loud as before. Conversations had softened, and people seemed a little more thoughtful than usual, as if something had stayed with them after the music ended. She continued her work, clearing tables, serving the last orders, and making sure everything was in place. On the outside, she looked the same as always, calm, focused, and quiet. But inside, things felt different. Her mind kept going back to the piano, to the way her fingers had moved without fear, to the way the music had felt natural. It wasn't just about what others had seen or heard. It was about what she had felt in that moment. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It was still there, not gone, just waiting. As the last guests began to leave, the man and his group remained seated. Their table had grown quieter too. The earlier conversations had slowed, replaced by something more reflective. At one point, one of the guests leaned closer to him and spoke softly. He listened, nodded once, but didn't say much in return. His attention seemed divided, part of it still resting on the moment that had changed the night. Finally, as the restaurant neared closing, he stood up again. This time, there was no audience watching closely. Most people had already left, and the remaining staff were busy finishing their tasks. The moment felt more private now. He walked toward her. She noticed him coming, but didn't stop what she was doing right away. She finished placing the last glass on a tray, then turned to face him. For a second, neither of them spoke. There was no pressure this time. No expectation from a crowd. Just a simple, quiet moment between two people. "You handled that well," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something genuine in it. She gave a small nod. "I just played." It wasn't just playing. She didn't argue, but she didn't agree out loud either. Some things felt better left unspoken. He glanced around the nearly empty restaurant, then back at her. "Do you ever think about going back to it?" he asked. The question stayed in the air for a moment. She didn't answer right away, because the truth was, she had thought about it. Many times. But thinking and doing were not the same. "It's not that simple," she said quietly. "Why not?" She looked at him, then away for a brief second. "Life changes," she said. "Responsibilities, timing, things get in the way." He listened carefully. There was no judgment in his expression. "Those things don't erase ability," he said. She gave a small, almost thoughtful smile. "No," she said, "but they can make you forget you have it." That answer stayed with him. He nodded slowly, as if understanding something deeper behind her words. For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached into his pocket and took out a small card. He held it between his fingers for a second before offering it to her. She looked at it, then at him. "I don't give this to many people," he said. There was no pride in his tone, just honesty. She hesitated before taking it. Her fingers brushed lightly against his as she accepted it. Then she looked down at the card. It had his name, his company, and a contact number. Simple, but meaningful. "If you ever decide you don't want to leave that part of your life behind," he continued, "call." She looked up at him again, a question in her eyes. "What would happen if I did?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave a small, thoughtful pause. Opportunities, he said finally. Introductions. A way to be heard in the right places. It wasn't a promise of success. It wasn't a guarantee. But it was something real. Something possible. She looked at the card again. Felt light in her hand, but heavy in meaning. I don't usually do this, he added. But I don't usually hear something like that either. She understood what he meant. Moments like that didn't happen often. For either of them. Thank you, she said softly. He gave a small nod. Not formal. Not distant. Just respectful. Then he stepped back. I hope you use it, he said. There was no pressure in his voice. Only a quiet hope. She didn't respond right away. Because she didn't know yet what she would do. But for the first time in a long time, the idea didn't feel impossible. He turned and walked back toward the exit, where his group was already preparing to leave. They spoke briefly, then headed out together. The door closed behind them, and just like that, the night returned to stillness. But it wasn't the same stillness as before. Something had changed. After finishing her last tasks, she found herself standing alone in the main area of the restaurant. The lights were dimmer now, the tables empty, the air quiet, and there it was. The piano, still in the same place, still waiting. She walked toward it slowly. This time, there was no hesitation in her steps. No one was watching. No one was asking anything from her. She reached the bench and sat down. Her hand rested lightly on the keys. For a moment, she just sat there, thinking, feeling, remembering. Then she played a single note. Soft, clear. It echoed gently in the empty room. She pressed another, and another. Not a performance, not a masterpiece, just simple notes. But this time they felt different. They didn't feel distant. They didn't feel like something from another life. They felt close, present, alive. A small smile appeared on her face. Not for anyone else, just for herself. She looked down at the card in her hand again, then placed it carefully on the piano beside her. Stayed there still and quiet. A choice. Possibility. Not forced. Not rushed. Just waiting. Just like the piano had been. Outside, the city continued as always. Cars moved. Lights flickered. People lived their lives. But inside that quiet restaurant, something had begun. Not a sudden change. Not a dramatic ending. But a beginning. A small step toward something she had once left behind. And maybe, just maybe, this time she wouldn't walk away from it.